to Gary Loke, who's the Head of Policy at the Equality Challenge Unit.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I understand I'm being filmed, so where's the best place to stand?
I think that's perfect, just where you are.
Okay,
here.
I'm going to stand here. I said I can be filmed, but I never want to see this film again because I hate watching myself on film. Thank you for inviting me today. When Dorcas invited me, she said that she would like me to do a session on the Equality Act. And for those of you who have seen the Act, it's about 350 pages of rather dry material. But if you live your life like I do and you like reading the law, then actually it's quite interesting. But what I thought I would do, and when I was thinking of the title of the day, is to change it to something about opportunities and responsibilities. So what the Act means for us as universities, what responsibilities it gives us as individuals within your departments, but what opportunities it presents us as well in terms of what are we trying to achieve and what are we trying to challenge the Act. Before we say that, I would like the session to be quite informal. There will be some group work. There's some case studies which I would like people to work through later. So if you're a group with a small number of people, I might move you around in a bit because it would be good to have some large groups to do group work. And if you have any questions throughout the day, please feel free to just ask them. Please stop me and ask me a question if you do, because I want it to be kind of an interactive learning session. I've also pitched the session at some of the basic fundamental concepts right from the start, because I wasn't sure how much knowledge people had about the Act. So I will start with the real fundamental concepts as well. But before that, let me start about talking about ECU. Equality Challenge Unit, we are the higher education sector body for equality and diversity. Can you see from there, by the way? It might be away. And we were started in 2001 as part of Universities UK, so the Vice Chancellor's membership body, and that's hence the name Equality Challenge Unit. We were a unit as part of UUK. Initially to look at equality issues for staff. In 2006 we became a separate charity, and we were given a student remit as well. So we now look at both staff and students, and we support universities across the UK with equality work. We're funded by the 4 Funding Council for the 4 nations, Universities UK, Guild HE. We now have 20 staff. I think your slides say 18 out this morning on the train. And we actually just opened an office in Scotland yesterday. So because our work in Scotland is growing, and we also cover colleges in Scotland, so we do HE and FE work in Scotland because of the funding arrangements in Scotland. So we really spend a lot of our time working with the sector on developing equality work. In your packs, which I'm hoping everybody has, there are handouts for the day. There is also today's slides. There is a handout sheet which has some of the fundamental concepts which I'll be talking about. There's also a programme of our work, so you'll see every year we produce a programme of the different things that we do. A lot of our work will lead to publications, either research reports. There are some briefings and fact sheets at the back as well, which we produce, all aimed at different functional areas of universities. So, there are some there, for example, on students going on work placements. What does equality look like on work placements? There are some leaflets for frontline student support staff about what does equality look like for LGB students in terms of student support. So please do have a look and take copies if you'd like. What I'm going to start with is to explore kind of the... I've put some old slides on. I apologise, I'm using older slides. You have slightly different slides in your pack. Is to explore some of the fundamental concepts of the Equality Act. And I'm going to start there so that we all start with a common place. But before I do that, I want to start by contextualising how we've got to this Act and where we are really. So the first piece of substantive equality anti-discrimination legislation was about 45 years ago. And at that stage, we understood inequality to be the mistreatment of people because of an identity. So it was an era where you saw signs like no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And it was really, directly because of their identities, we didn't welcome them. We now know that to be direct discrimination. So you are treating someone differently because of their identity. Over time, we've gained an understanding of indirect discrimination, harassment, and victimization, and I'll talk through all these concepts in a bit. But critically, it wasn't until the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, so this is the Stephen Lawrence murder, that we started to understand that there was systematic or cultural discrimination embedded in various systems that collectively gave us institutional discrimination. And then we had our first public sector duty on race. That was followed by a public sector duty on disability and a public sector duty on gender. And now with the Equality Act, we have a public sector duty on all the protected characteristics. And so we've actually shifted our understanding from direct, just because of who you are, to understanding that actually there is cultural and systemic discrimination within systems. And I think that has been one of the major shifts, and I think that's been one of the great things about the Equality Act was bringing that all together into one piece of legislation. And it's through that I want to explore what the Equality Act means for us in terms of our responsibilities, but also how it impacts on the higher education sector and what opportunities it gives us to overcome challenges. So, moving to the fundamental concepts, what is covered by the Equality Act? So, if you look at the first 6 of those on the list, many people think of equality as somebody else, not like us. It's, equality applies to somebody else. But actually, if you look at the first 6, apart from disability, everybody in this room has those characteristics. You have an age, you have a race, you have a religion or belief or no belief, you have a sexual orientation, and you have a sex. You have those. So actually, the Equality Act is about protecting everybody, and that's what the Act aims to achieve. In the Equality Act, we had those 6 from previous pieces of legislation, but we've also made stronger protection on gender reassignment. We've pulled out pregnancy and maternity as a specific area where we recognise that women face disadvantage and made that stronger in the Act. And there is an odd one about marriage and civil partnership, which is it's an odd asymmetric protection. So it protects people who are married or in civil partnerships. It doesn't protect people who are single, divorced, or not married, not in civil partnership. And that's only an employment function. But that's a slightly asymmetric one, and I wouldn't worry too much about that one. But those are the 9 areas that the Equality Act covers. The Equality Act gained royal assent in April 10, so that was April 2 years ago. And much of the provisions came into force in October 2010. And I highlighted some of the key areas here. So the Act covers England, Scotland and Wales. Northern Ireland has its own separate legislation about equality. And what it did was really harmonise and increase protection across the 9 areas I've just talked about. It also gave us some changes in definition. So I will explain these a little bit more in the next few slides. But it gave us the new definitions on protection around association and perception. I will talk about these separately in a new slide. It extended protection to new characteristics. So you saw here earlier, we used to have protection around the first 6 in distinct pieces of legislation. We brought those all together and extended protection to the new areas in a slightly different way and harmonised it. It also gave us new types of disability discrimination. I will talk about those in the further slides. Some to resolve some of the issues that the law had. Inadvertently, the law lords had rules about certain things about disability, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And we need to resolve that. So we've got new forms of protection for disabled people. So we now have protection, indirect discrimination protection for disabled people, and a new kind of protection called arising from. But I will talk about that in a bit as well. And then it gave new powers as well. So it strengthened the powers of employment tribunals. So it gave employment tribunals not just the right to rule about that individual case, but they could make recommendations to an organisation that actually you've been found to be discriminating here. We would like you to change your practice around this area. While they weren't binding, they could be used in further cases. So that it gave new powers to employment tribunals. It harmonised our voluntary positive action measures, and again I'll talk about positive action later as well. It put in new powers on third-party harassment. So this was to protect staff who were being harassed by a third party. So if you worked in, say, on a university campus and you had a contractor who was harassing a member of staff, and that member of staff had reported it several times and nothing was being done, then it introduced new powers to protect the member of staff. And it also outlawed pre-employment health questionnaires. So it prevented institutions from asking of people's health before they offered them a job. Now, some of these are under review, and you will see a couple in brackets under review. I won't comment about this government, but this piece of legislation was passed under the previous government, and this government has decided that they wish to review some of these because they don't think they're right. It's an interesting piece. If you do look at the third-party harassment consultation, which is currently underway, they've managed to calculate what third-party harassment will cost businesses, and it's come up with this incredibly long formula, which, unless I think you're a mathematician, you won't understand because it's impossible to read. At the back of the room, you will see these. If you want, please do take copies or download them, or we can send you more copies. And that's our comprehensive briefing on all the different provisions and how they apply to the university sector. So I've just put one slide up here, but there are 27 pages of information on all these provisions in there. Right. So I'm going to move now to kind of prohibited conduct. So these are the kind of fundamental concepts. Direct discrimination. This is what I talked about. So this was our first understanding of equality practice and discrimination. So it really is treating someone less favourably because they have a particular characteristic. So here, we give an example of if you only shortlist male applicants for interview because you assume a woman won't fit into the role, that's direct sex discrimination. You assume that that's the case. Or you only have promotion opportunities for men, for example. That would be the same thing. You can sometimes inadvertently do it by thinking, for example, a student union bar decides not to interview a Muslim applicant because they think, because of the basis of their religion, they don't want to work in a bar, and that would be direct kind of religion and belief discrimination. So it's really just treating someone differently because of one of the 9 protected characteristics. Now in terms of direct discrimination, it can never be justified, so you can't say, oh, I treated him that way because of, you can't justify it, you can't say I've done it and try to justify it. The only one you can justify direct discrimination is age, and that's a caveat. So, and it has to be justified because there's a genuine reason about a concern for someone's age, and where you think it's necessary and appropriate in order to do so. So the example we've given you here is where a university refuses to admit a 16-year-old to a teaching course because they would be unable to go on a practical element of the course, which is required to qualify for teacher training. And so this would be a proportionate means to say, actually, we're directly excluding someone because of their age, but there's a genuine reason to do so. So age is the only area that you would be allowed to justify why you're discriminated. But the test is high, and you need to think very clearly about why you want to do so and whether it's a proportionate means to achieving something. So that's the first area, that's direct discrimination, which is one of the core concepts. Now, in the Equality Act, we extended our understanding of direct discrimination to include association and perception. So I talked about this earlier. So this is where discrimination is based on if someone's being associated to someone else with a protected characteristic. So the example we've given here is a student who has a child with ADHD, and they refuse to access to the graduation ceremony because you fear that the child's behaviour will be disruptive during the ceremony. Now, the student themselves doesn't have ADHD or disability, but their child does. And so this is discrimination by association to someone who is disabled. And the law now extends our understanding of direct discrimination to being discriminated against associated to someone with a characteristic as opposed to the person itself. So that's one of the new areas that the law has extended it to. The other area is perception. Now, some of this already applied before the Act, but it harmonised it across the protected characteristics. So is where one perceives someone to have a characteristic, even whether or not they have it, it doesn't matter. So the example here is a mental health and wellbeing officer that refuses to work with a student because they believe that the student is gay, irrespective of whether the student is gay or not. It's a perception. They've decided in their mind that they perceive this person to have that characteristic, and they refuse to work with that person. It doesn't matter whether the person is gay or not, it's about perception. So the Equality Act kind of extended our understanding of direct discrimination to apply to these 2 areas as well. So that's new in the Act. It previously was for different protected characteristics, but the law harmonised it and pulled it all together into different protected characteristics. Right, I'm going to move on to the second concept. So we've talked about direct discrimination, and now I'm going to look at indirect discrimination. So this is where an understanding has started to develop. So indirect discrimination is where you work in a way that might seem to treat everybody fairly in practice. Everything, you put something on paper, the policy looks like it's fair, but actually what happens in practice is that you are putting some people from a particular group at a disadvantage. So again, as an example here, if the university requires all staff to commit to working 8 to 11 every night because that's how shifts work. It might indirectly discriminate against women who are more likely to be primary carers of children. So it's about thinking about, it might on the surface look like a fair criteria, but actually does it indirectly discriminate against certain groups. Now importantly, unlike direct discrimination, indirect discrimination can be justified. So I talked about earlier how direct discrimination, you can never justify it. Indirect discrimination you can. So you will need to explore, for example, whether there is a genuine business need for certain things to happen. But again, you would want to think through whether it's a proportionate, do you really need people to work those times, or can work be fulfilled in a different way? When we do the case studies, there will be some exploration of these things, so I won't go into justification at the moment because you'll be thinking through whether you can ever justify certain things in the case studies. Right. This is a new one. So this is one of the two areas I talked about in terms of disability discrimination. So there is a new area that is discrimination arising from disability. And that's where you treat a disabled person in a way because of their disability, because of something arising from the disability as opposed to their disability itself. So it's not, you're not saying, for example, so direct discrimination would be, for example, I'm not admitting you to this event because you're blind, for example. That would be direct. Or I'm not employing you because I know you have a mental health issue, for example. That would be direct discrimination. It's where something arises out of their disability that, and you treat someone differently because of that it becomes disability arising from disability. So again, you have an example on there on your sheets where an employer dismisses a worker because they have 3 months off sick leave. They're aware that the person has a disability and most of her sick leave is related to that disability. So it's not the actual disability, it's the relationship to the disability. And this is where it becomes disability arising from discrimination. It's quite a technical aspect of the law, and it was put in to resolve some of the test cases with the law lords previously. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I think that the thing to think about is that you would apply the same concept now, because we didn't used to have indirect discrimination relating to disability. We do now. And what this does is to allow for particular cases of disability. So I came to the issue about the blind person, for example. So to say I'm not admitting someone who's blind, that's direct discrimination. If we had a sign that says there are no dogs allowed in this room, that might be indirect discrimination against blind people. What this provision allows for is individual situations that indirect discrimination may not cover. And this provision was put in there because what it recognises that disability or the impact of someone's disability arises in different ways. And so it may not be indirect discrimination because it's so broad. It might be that actually it only applies to one individual person. And so it allows for that protection as well. So it gives the full range of protection to disabled people, which previously the law didn't quite have because of the way that the law lords had ruled about disability. So it's something to be aware of, but I wouldn't be too worried about the technical details about it. Just remember that disabled people are now protected much more in the Act than they used to be. Right. I'm going to move on to the third area, which is harassment. So harassment here is unwanted conduct linked to someone's protected characteristic, which has the purpose of violating someone's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile environment. So it might, for example, be where a staff member, again the example here, comments on someone's ethnicity, which makes them feel uncomfortable. It might be that you have office banter, for example. People are talking, they crack jokes about race, for example, which makes other people feel uncomfortable. So it's about creating an environment where someone feels uncomfortable in. Now, what is important to note here is that the perception of the recipient of the harassment is important. Because there have been cases where even though the intention hasn't been there, like office banter, it's actually the perception which is more important than it. At the same time, courts and tribunals will have to continue to balance competing rights. So in a university setting, for example, what happens in a tutorial, for example, if we were talking about, again, that would be a case study example as far as I will go to, but in a tutorial where you have academic freedom and academic discussion, if someone expresses a view about a certain racial group, for example, or a view about homosexuality, is that legitimate academic discussion or is that harassment? So there is a need to balance competing views here, and we will do some of that when we go to the case study as well. The next area is victimization. So this is where you treat someone less favorably because they've brought a claim of discrimination or are supporting someone else's claim. Again, a straightforward example here is, a student who alleges they've encountered racism from a tutor, and as a result they're ignored by other members of staff. Or an employer who brands an employee a troublemaker because they've put in a case, a discrimination case, and they're not, they're kind of ignored within an organisation. So this is where you victimise someone because they started to make a claim or are supporting someone else to make a claim. So that's one of the other areas. And finally, the last area of prohibited conduct here, which I'll talk about, is to do with disability again, and that's the failure to make reasonable adjustments. Is everybody aware of reasonable adjustments? So institutions have to make adjustments for disabled people. Again, here, these are the criteria. I won't read them out. But again, what is important to remember here is, if you look at previous test cases in the law, when making decisions about reasonable adjustments, it's important to think about the institution as a whole. You can't think about, oh, my departmental budget is too small, I can't afford to make this. Because the courts have ruled that actually it's not the individual department, it would look at the finances of an entire institution to say actually the university can afford it because it's one entity. So to think about the whole rather than individual departments. I'm going to talk about a couple more concepts. Actually, this is the last concept, and I'm going to kind of do some case studies because I've been just kind of talking at you. So, the final area I want to talk about, which is not prohibited conduct, actually, it's actually permitted conduct. I apologise, your slides actually corrected this. I've kind of uploaded an older version of the slide by accident. Is positive action. So, institutions are allowed to adopt voluntary positive action measures. So, to alleviate disadvantage or reduce underrepresentation. So, for example, it used to be that in the previous race, disability and gender duties, you could have positive action, but they were quite complicated. It depended on what you were trying to achieve and what you were allowed. Now it's been harmonised, and that's one of the great things about this Act. It's made it slightly simpler. But if, for example, you wanted to encourage men into teaching, for example, so we know that there's a shortage, or there is underrepresentation of men in primary school teaching. And to encourage more men into teaching, you might have a taster day for men to go into a primary school to work with children, for example. Now that would be lawful positive action to try and encourage more men to teaching. Where it becomes positive discrimination, and this is where the line needs to be drawn, is if you guarantee that men will get on the course, or you guarantee that they will get a job after the course because they've done the course. That's where you positively discriminate, and that's unlawful. So it's about the encouragement to get people into certain areas where you know they're underrepresented, and that's where positive action can be used. There is a big debate about whether institutions should use bursaries and scholarships to encourage people onto certain courses. We have a briefing about that as well because that's quite a complex area. Some institutions will have, especially older institutions, will have bursaries that say, we've come across fascinating ones which say, it's a bursary only for Protestant students in this part of Scotland. Because that's where the money has come from, and there's been a lot of thinking about, well, is that positive discrimination or positive action? Because it's such historic discrimination that we're not sure it applies anymore. And so that we have a specific briefing that looks at the complexities on whether they apply and whether the financial incentive is the right thing to give to people who want to encourage them. It harmonised all the provisions that apply to students. But there are now new measures for employment. So there is now a tie-break provision for employment. So what this basically says is if you have two equally qualified candidates at interview, and you can't decide which one to employ, you can employ someone with a protected characteristic that is underrepresented. I don't know any university that has used it yet. I know some universities are thinking about using it. It's a fascinating one because what does equally qualified mean? There isn't that clarity on that. And also, I think a lot of universities are reticent to say, actually, we're employing someone because of a protected characteristic. But the provision is there. I'll be interested to see whether people do use it. But as far as I know, nobody has used it or publicly said they've used it. if you have more than 150 employees, you need to publish information about the different protected characteristics and to evidence that you're not discriminating against in different ways and to see what you're doing about them. And then you use that evidence and to set equality objectives, so what objectives you're trying to achieve. Now, the important thing about the specific duties is that they're meant to support the university meet the general duties. So always go back to the general duty. That's what the institution has to do. The specific duties are to help the institution meet that. Because if you ever look at any of the case law around the previous duties, judges never find a failure to meet the specific duties. It was a failure to meet the specific duties and therefore the general duty that's important. So always remember the general duty, but the specifics are there to help you do it. So, like I said, every institution sets equality objectives. I hope you have seen yours. I'm going to speak about one of them in particular because I want you to do some discussion about that right at the end. Now, but what can the objectives do? So this is where I'm going to talk about the opportunities. Because at the back you will find different publications, and I want to talk about widely in the higher education context what are some of the challenges that we face and what some of the objectives that people can set around them. So if we look at race, for example, we will find that nationally we have the number of black and minority ethnic students is growing across the UK. It's increased exponentially. At the same time, we have the biggest attainment gap, and this is what I find terribly shocking. So you'll see that if you're a white student, this is the likelihood of you getting a 2-1 or a first. If you were a black student, this is the likelihood of you getting a 2-1 or first. At the same time, it's not good enough to say, oh yeah, we've got more and more black students in the system. Actually, they're coming out with different outcomes at the end, and that's shocking, basically. For all ethnic groups, you will find the differentials are different. The likelihood of getting a first or 2-1 is different. And when we did research about this, we controlled for all sorts of factors. We controlled for prior education attainment, for parental income, parental education before that, and there was still a differential. So there's something in the system that's quite systemic about it. We've got several publications about this as well, about the degree attainment gap, which for me is worrying, especially when we move into an era of charging £9,000 and students expecting employment and outcomes at the end of it. It also is a question for me about the pipeline issue, because we look at the number of staff in the sector, and you can see increasingly the number of black and minority staff rising. But if you're less likely to get a first or 2-1, are you going to stay in academia? Are we going to see that pipeline issue dissipate as well? Again, you'll see the level of professors here. Shockingly here, if you were UK black, so you're UK born and black, you are least likely of all UK ethnicities to be a professor. There are less than 50 black professors in the UK. So less than 50 black UK born professors in the country, which is horrific. So here are some of the challenges that the sector faces in terms of race. If we look at disability, here we have the student profile, so you will see roughly kind of the disclosure rates are going up, so students are more likely to declare disability. But they're less likely to obtain a first or 2-1, so if you're disabled. However, students who are in receipt of disability support allowance are more likely to obtain that first or 2-1 than if you weren't in receipt of it. So we encourage institutions to think about how they support disabled students, to think, apply for DSA at an early stage. We also encourage institutions to help students who are applying to institutions apply for DSA, because it's transferable. If they say apply for 6, through UCAS, apply for 6 institutions, DSA is portable to the next institution, so it doesn't matter whether they come to Exeter or not. There is a report in the back here, and we have the kind of top 10 things that institutions can do to support disabled staff, because generally there is a lack of support for disabled staff when compared to disabled students. There is a lot in place for students, but a lot of staff say actually there isn't as much in place for staff. And there are real issues about whether staff feel comfortable disclosing that lack of support. Mental health came out as a real issue that institutions are grappling with. But the way we structured this report, as is available at the back, is here are the top 10 things you can do as an institution to support disabled staff as well. So please help yourself to come to that. Then we have gender, which I'm moving into. So over the last 7 years, there have been considerably more women entering higher education. but there is considerable segregation. So you see right at the top, the engineering and technology, we have 16% women. You go subjects allied to medicine, 80% women. So there's a large kind of differential between the disciplines. We also know that men or male students are less likely to, are more likely to attain a lower class degree or withdraw from university. And we've done a bit of work about that, about the kind of access to pastoral support that male students do. We've published something recently which is available online about how you might adapt student support services to better meet the needs of male students, about how you might repackage some of it, because a lot of male students feel uncomfortable seeking support because they think it's a sign of weakness and vulnerability as opposed to women, so there are different things there. But while we have more women going to the undergraduate level, the number of female professors, however, isn't keeping pace. So there is a terrible pipeline where we have more female undergraduates, more female postgraduates, and then we get to the professor level. And overall, there are 19.1 professors of professors are women. I know Exeter is 19.5, so well done, you're above the national average, but don't rest on your laurels. 19.5 is still not good enough. And if you go to the set subjects, so science, engineering, and technology, it drops to 15.1. It's low. And if you think back, actually, about some of the disciplines where you have 80% women going into the undergraduate level, then you end up with a 19% professor for females. There is something wrong with the system where women are just falling off the agenda, and these are some of the challenges that the sector faces. Here we have a graph about equal pay, and again there is a pay gap in the sector. Women are generally paid less than men. Apart from in a couple of categories actually, which unsurprisingly or very stereotypically are in caretakers, nursery nurses, and secretarial receptionist typists and telephonists. Is that even a word? It is. And so, hello, I remember the police has just walked in. And so, yeah, so there are issues about gender as well. Now, the data that we've gathered here is available in our publications about statistics, but what we don't have is statistics around things like sexual orientation, religion, belief, because they haven't been collected. They will be collected from 2014, or there's a voluntary collection for institutions. I don't know whether Exeter plans to collect it. I'm looking at Dorcas that I don't know, but have decided. So we don't actually have hard data. So what we have done as an organisation is to do pieces of work around it, because we know that we need some of this data. In 2009, we ran the first national piece of work around the experience of LGBT staff and students in HE. Again, there's a full report about it if you want to download a copy. But here we have LGBT students and their experience of negative treatment, and you'll find, shockingly, almost 50% of them said they were treated in a negative way because of their sexual orientation by other students. It was an interesting piece of work for us, this research, because we even had phone calls on our answer machines asking us why we were doing this work. We had rude phone calls saying to us, why are you doing this work? It's not important. Some very trenchant views about it. It's a contested, difficult area, which was shocking to us, but some of the results on this are shocking if you look at it. If you look at staff, again, you will find quite high levels here of a poor treatment and comments by other staff. And one of the things that a lot of staff in the interviews said was that a lot of them feared about their own employment security if they were out at work. They thought that an LGBT identity might compromise their research agendas, that they are pigeonholed into researching certain things because of their sexual orientation, and so they don't talk about their sexual orientation at work, which was fascinating. They think about it this way. It's the same for a lot of black staff actually, who say that actually because we are black staff, we are given portfolios about race equality. We're asked to research race things, or we're asked to be the equality person at our university, because we're black, we must be interested in equality. And it's fascinating how people get pigeonholed into these areas. Again, like I said, with religion and belief, we have no national data. We've published this recently. I think there are some copies of this at the back, actually. Very limited around the data. But what we found is that some groups felt unable to access the full range of activities because of a perceived lack of understanding of their needs, really. Alcohol was a big issue for many student groups, and that use of alcohol on campuses in sporting groups, in Freshers Week, the way things are socialised made them feel really excluded. And it was interesting that most people go, oh, it's mostly Muslim students. It wasn't actually mostly Muslim students. There were a lot of black Pentecostal Christian students who said actually they don't drink either, and they didn't want to participate in sport because they felt that the drinking culture precluded them from doing so. So it was fascinating about that. There was a lot of thinking here about how they felt excluded because of universities, a lot of them purporting to be secular and therefore not accommodating religious belief. And I would say secular doesn't mean the absence of religious belief. It just means that you need to think about it a lot more. So there was a full report there. Finally, one of the other sort of challenges about age is about managing the abolition of the default retirement age, and you had only to contend with earlier. So how is the planning of performance management and the opportunity presents us really about full research careers and flexible working. Otherwise, thank you very much.